Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. Welcome to another edition of Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie.
And I'm Nora St. John.
And today we're going to be talking about stability versus mobility. It's something that we've been hearing a lot about fitness conferences for many years. It seemed like for years it was all about strength training. Then it became functional training. That was sort of the F word. It was everywhere. Functionality and, stand on a Bosu ball and balance a ball on your head and juggle these. Yeah, all that so-called functional activity. And then mobility has hit for the last couple of years. And my thing has always been, are we ready for that? Is the client ready to do any mobility training? And when are they going to be ready for it? Because we really need to talk about stability at the same time because, let's face it, we need both to be stable and mobile depending on the joint that we're talking about.
And one of the things that I like to think about here and always want to put in here is stability and mobility are not two things on the ends of like A and B, right? This is not digital. This is analog. This space between stability and mobility is a continuum.
Absolutely.
Some people are more mobile, people are more stable. Some parts of their bodies are more mobile, some parts are more stable. So it's also one of those things where people often really talk about it as we're going to do mobility or we're going to do stability. It's like, okay, let's just broaden that out. And let's really look at the continuum between the two, right? And for each individual client, figuring out, are they more mobile? Do they need more stability? Or are they more stable? Do they need more mobility, right? That's always kind of a first, not always the first assessment, but something I'm always looking at with a client on the first day. It's like, are they more on the mobile side? Are they more on the stable side? And what am I going to do with that?
And for someone like yourself, you've worked with a lot of dancers and a lot of people in the Pilates world who probably are a little bit more on the mobile side, almost to the point of hypermobility in certain joints. So for them, they would absolutely need to be more stable, almost maybe to the point of they're not going to train mobility for a long time because they've done it for the last 25 years. So for those people,
exactly,
you need to focus on the stability aspect versus the guy who has been a desk jockey and done absolutely nothing and then starts weight training and his body just cinches up and suddenly he can't move. Well, he's a little overly stable and may need to move more.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where, with every client, I try to figure that out quickly. I think about one particular client who was a ballerina, a very high-level ballerina, and she was so hypermobile. She probably would have, had EDS or one of the hypermobility issues. That's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome,
yep.
EDS, because she was so wiggly. And her program was entirely strength and stability based.
Yep. And
she would do an hour to an hour and a half every day. All strength and stability work, and that's what kept her together so she could do her job.
Yep.
For other clients, like they're so stiff that all they've got to do is mobility work to be able to get their leg where it needs to go or their arm where it needs to go.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we do have a tendency to sort of think about dancers. They're going to need more stability just because they are usually hypermobile because they've been training flexibility for their whole lives. Whereas we see a lot of former athletes who are going to actually be in the middle of that scale because they may have been training for certain things, like we've talked about baseball pitchers before. So for them, they are incredibly strong in certain regards and probably tight in certain regards, but at the same time, they have to have incredible amounts of flexibility in order to do what they do, like a baseball catcher or pitcher. Their adductors, their hip range of motion has to be incredibly large in comparison to, a football player or, a pickleball player or tennis player or something like that. So we can't just say all athletes are going to fall into one category because based on what they do and what they've trained, if they've trained to have those certain muscles to be so mobile, well, maybe we want to take a look at that and make sure that they're staying within that range of motion and not going overboard or that it's not causing other issues.
Right. I think about some of the swimmers that I've worked with. I looked at a number of Olympic swimmers, both synchronized and competitive. And there you've got, again, that combination of their shoulders are generally on the super loose side. because that's what you need to generate power for swimming. But sometimes that hypermobility, generally of the whole shoulder girdle area and the thorax, can lead to real stiffness in the low back and hips. Sometimes it's like the body tries to accommodate for a very loose area by really stiffening up somewhere else to create the stability they need to support that mobility. So it's also not looking just at the whole body, but looking at the different parts and how they're going together, working together, or not working together.
And it's interesting you say that, because I've worked with people I've actually worked with yogis, people who teach yoga. And what's amazing is that you'd think how flexible these people are. Oh my gosh. I found it to be the opposite. Certain areas were very flexible. They'd be standing on one foot or they'd be doing something and I'd be thinking, wow, very flexible here, but can you see how tight you are here? And you just make some small adjustment and they say, I can't move that well. They've trained certain poses, they've trained certain motions for so long that they've gotten good. They developed the skill for those motions, so they appear to be very flexible. They appear to be very mobile. But then you make them do something else and all of a sudden, oh, I really don't move well that direction. So I found that too. And again, it's whether you've developed a skill or, years and years of one style of training can really do that.
Brian, would you give an example of that? I'm just curious because I've worked with a lot of yogis as well, and I'm trying to think where I see their tight spots. So do you have a client in mind that makes you think about that?
Yeah, one of my clients was teaching yoga, and a lot of her poses, now she taught Bikram primarily, so they're limited as to the number of poses that they do just in general. Forgive me, I'm not going to even try and attempt to say any of these, poses, but let's just talk about the tree pose, for instance. Mm-hmm. They can maintain that. She could maintain that for so long. The problem is she was just sort of letting her hips sink out and really allowing her whole body to sort of sit into her, I'm going to say she was doing it on her left leg. She was tightening up that area so that she wasn't even, her gluteus medius wasn't able to support and be under her. She couldn't stand up tall through that leg. She was just sitting out in the joint, and she was actually tightening through her SI joints because she was actually doing a little bit of rotation, external rotation, really sitting into the joints. And all of her pelvic floor was that side was tightening up. The piriformis was overly tightened, and she was having some low back issues because of it. That when I looked at that, I was thinking, wait a minute. And all I did was make some subtle changes, and she thought, I can't really get out of this. I can't. And once I got her into the correct position, she said, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this like crazy, but she couldn't hold it for very long. So she lacked the endurance to even get out of that position. And we had to really work on internal rotation for a while because the external rotators were just so bloody tight that she just had a hard time in that position. So in the standing position, but in other positions where her hip was flexed, she had a lot of internal rotation. So it was interesting that it was very much specific to a neutral state of the pelvis and femur in a standing position is what was tight in external rotation, but then non-weighted, it wasn't.
So this brings up some of what I like to talk about with stability and mobility, which is that very often, I think this is a good example of one kind of stability, if you like. Essentially, I would describe that as she didn't have the support to hold the joint in the right position, right, to really support her femur underneath her pelvis in that exercise. Which is why you keep saying she swung her hip out. And then when you have mobility that isn't supported correctly, that's when you get that over tightness and those funky places which are trying to compensate for a lack of stability really deep in the joint. Yep. Right? And instead, the superficial muscles have to do the job of holding that together, and that often is where pain comes from.
And this is something that I talk about in a lot of my classes. You've heard this so many times before. We talk about the stabilizers versus mobilizers. Our superficial muscles, which, like you said, they have a tendency to grip on us. They tend to want to, I literally just got out of a class teaching, and the simple exercise of marching, this one gentleman couldn't not use his abs. Just a march, just bring one knee in. So every time he did it, his abs tightened up so much that he couldn't even try to lift the leg without tensing up all four levels of the abs. He was bodybuilder type. And I said, look, you've been walking around keeping these tight all the time for so long that you've literally trained those muscles how to grip. how to, instead of let them relax and let the muscles that are supposed to flex the hip, because you get into anatomy, you're just talking about, look, we're asking the hip flexor to work. We're just lifting the leg. It has nothing to do with the rectus abdominis or even the transverse, but I said I don't mind the transverse firing, but you don't need your external and internal obliques to do it. You don't need everything else. And he had the hardest time relaxing those superficial mobilizing muscles, because so that's what he's been using for years rather than the deeper muscles. And literally I de-weighted his leg and got him into hip flexion. He said, oh my gosh, I can feel my hip flexor working. He'd never felt it because he's overworked the exterior muscles. So all of those deep muscles, those stabilizing muscles haven't been firing on this guy. And he wasn't that old. He was in his 30s. He was in his early 30s. And I said, look, this is something you need to start working on because this could lead to issues down the road. I'm thinking to someone I work with who former high level athlete, and now she loves to do weightlifting and all of this sort of thing. She can't not squeeze her butt in any exercise. Everything she does, she squeezes it manually. And I'm standing behind her and I'm whacking it saying, relax your butt. Just relax. Every time you stand up, you don't have to squeeze it. And she has pelvic issues. Well, no wonder you have pelvic issues. Again, trying to get the outer muscles to do what the inner muscles should be doing, to stabilize the joints, to put them where they need to be, and just allow the body to move through space without trying to force it through all these external, muscle, flexing routines.
And that talks a lot about efficiency, because efficiency, when you see somebody who moves gracefully and efficiently, like I'm thinking about watching Olympic runners. I love to watch Olympic sprinters, Usain Bolt and all of his cronies, because you see freedom of motion, right? Like incredible, like really big range of motion. When they split their legs to take those strides, they're going full hip extension and, high hip flexion. But they're controlled, they're contained, they're moving in exactly the right coordination in terms of the joint, in terms of how the rest of the body focuses with it. And they've got that deep internal stability so that they can have that external mobility. Yep. Like a lot of times if you get stability at the joint level or, deeper into the body, then you have the freedom on the outside. And you see that, I think, with the most graceful movers, at least in my opinion.
No, very true. Very true, yeah. And when you talk about efficiency, if you look at someone who does move well, it doesn't look like they're trying.
No, it doesn't look hard.
No, and I watched, first time this was ever brought up to me, a gentleman I was taking a class from, he was a martial artist. And he said, you watch a martial artist walk across the room and they glide.
Yeah.
They're not trying.
Absolutely.
You watch a bodybuilder or a weightlifter walk across the room, and most of them, are trying to be Godzilla. They're trying to, every single muscle is flexed, and I'm trying to work everything. And I think that's a different mindset. Instead of just allowing the body to move through space. If you watch Usain Bolt walk, I guarantee he's not squeezing his butt with every step, and he's not tensing his abs. He's just existing. And allowing his body to move. Dancers, same thing. They just walk. And they look like they're walking with a little bit more grace than the average person because their body is able to, first of all, but they often have more efficiency of movement and an ease of movement.
And this brings us to, we wanted to talk about this whole idea of the kinetic chain, right? Because both you and I have looked at the kinetic chain for years, and there's a very classic kinetic chain, of those of you who don't know it, where you have a stable joint followed by a mobile joint, followed by a stable joint, followed by a mobile joint. Brian, would you kind of just describe that?
Sure.
What are the different points in the typical kinetic chain as it's talked about?
Normally what it is you start it with the foot. Okay, the foot is going to be stable. They consider the foot to be a stable joint, whereas the ankle is mobile. Okay, and then we go up to the knee. The knee is stable. The hip is mobile. The spine is, the pelvis is stable. The spine is mobile. The scapula is stable. The shoulders are mobile. The neck is stable. And if you want to get into the arms, you can talk about, the glenohumeral joint is going to be mobile, whereas the elbow is stable and the wrist is going to be mobile. And if you look at that, what that would tell me is that the feet shouldn't move at all. If they're stable, they should have very little movement. The knees should have very little movement. And I mean, you brought this to my attention after I taught a class on stability and mobility. I mean, you just questioned me and just said, well, the knee, you say it's stable. How stable is it? I mean, you just said how many degrees does it flex? Like, oh yeah, it does flex. It does come back to extension. It's got a lot of range of motion. So
Yeah.
that traditional thought process of one joint stable, one joint mobile, really, when you think about it, every joint moves. And every joint moves to a significant degree.
Right, and in very different ways. I mean, in some ways, like when I think about some of those models, I often think about them as just creating a simple way of thinking about things, right? Because the knee primarily moves the sagittal plane.
Yep.
Compared to the hip, which moves in every plane. So there's that idea of the stability is because it is primarily a sagittal mover. But the ankle's pretty stable.
It should
the
be.
foot isn't. I mean, the foot has tremendous amount of mobility. And it has to. I mean, again, unless you're in a really stiff tennis shoe, the job of the foot, if you think about developmental history, is to absorb forces from an uneven surface that we've used to walk on.
Yep.
Roots and rocks and sand and whatever. And to be able to mold to that.
And think of it this way. Yeah. My brain has always thought of this too, saying, okay, it's supposed to be stable. How many joints are there?
26, I think.
Yeah.
If I just did my footwork.
There's a ton of joints in there that require. Yeah. Now, if I were to lift it up in the air with no muscular tension whatsoever, it does sort of hang and it is softened.
Yeah.
Okay. That's one thing. And all of those can move. They're malleable. I mean, when we take a step, our tarsal bones roll to the side, almost like logs rolling, and, you get to the phalanges and they're going to flex and extend. And the tarsal bones themselves are working to create a stable environment, but they're moving. There's motion between them. If you've talked to anybody who's had them fused for whatever reason, suddenly their foot doesn't work as well. So there's a ton of movement. And you can't, and when I thought of this and I looked at this originally, I went, well, maybe they're talking about rotation. Because when you think about the ankle does rotation. The hip does rotation. So if you think about it from a rotation standpoint, maybe that's what they're talking about because the knee doesn't rotate. Like you said, sagittal plane, only one plane of motion. But look at the foot. There's so much movement in there.
So much.
So much movement.
And so much that's really important.
Yes.
It's not like, you really need to have that for an efficient force transfer from the ground up through the body.
It took me a long time to realize that instead of thinking about inherent mobility and stability, that maybe this chart is more for how we should think about training the body rather than what has inherent stability or mobility. Because going back to the spine, we want to train spinal stability because if we lack that, we're going to lead to other issues. We want to train hip mobility. We want to train, ankle mobility. And knee, we really don't need a whole lot of mobility on that. We want to almost train it to be more stable because if it starts getting unstable, we see more instability of the knee, we're going to have more issues. Just like if we see more instability of the lumbar spine. So my mindset was almost like, well, maybe that's what they're trying to say they didn't say it with this chart, but maybe it's more, that's how we should look at it. If that makes any sense.
I think that's a really nice way to, I think that's a nice way to change that around a little bit because when I looked at it, I always looked at it as these are the functions of those joints. These are the functions of those parts of the kinetic chain. But I think you're right. I think it's more that, with the knee, you're kind of working on stability. With the hip, you're often working on mobility, but I could argue that both ways.
Oh, absolutely. No, right? Absolutely.
A lot of people, I'm looking at stability of the hip, and I'm looking at, mobility of the foot, for example.
Absolutely.
If somebody's stiff. So anyway, it was just one of those things that I think it's very easy to do that black and white.
Yes.
And the body is like always gray. The body is always shades. Again, that continuum from mobility to stability and different body parts and what is important for that client in that moment. Do they need more stability? Do they need more mobility? How do they gain that? What do we work on?
And you said it right there. It depends on the client in front of you. If you looked at the giant continuum, between stability and mobility and where they need to train their body or even those specific joints, you're going to see that sliding scale. You're going to see that certain people may need a little bit more stability of this, but they have a lot more mobility here. I trained a rock climber who was 23 years old. He was the son of one of my clients who needed a double shoulder replacement. And when I saw him, I thought, I mean, he was in awesome shape. And I looked at his shoulders and thought, well, no wonder he's been hanging literally from the joint on rocks and taught himself to do that so he could hang by his fingertips and let all the other tissues relax through his arm. And he would do that for minutes and minutes and minutes on end. And all we worked on was scapular and glenohumeral stability over and over and over again for 6 months. He didn't need shoulder replacement surgery, but that's what the doctors wanted to do. And I said, at this age, I said, you can kiss your shoulders goodbye. Yeah, it's way too invasive, something that young. But we got him back into, does he have a little labral tears? Of course he does. I mean, he caused them, but he's stable now. So again, that client had so much mobility, a lot like yours, that we had to pull him back toward the stable side, almost to the opposite extreme. But when it came to the rest of his body, he was in incredible shape, but didn't really train it that much. I needed to work a little bit more on everything. So when it came to the hips and the lower body, the core, it was a lot more a balanced routine, between mobility and stability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think about similar idea, same client or different client. She was a middle-aged woman with 3 kids, and she was a golfer. And she loved golf, but she was not very good at it. And she kept wanting to get better. This is typical. I'm sure many of you guys have clients out there like this. Golfing is one of those things people approach and then attack.
Yep.
And it was interesting because she was extremely loose everywhere except for her hamstrings.
Oh.
So she was slightly kyphotic. She kind of collapsed posture, right? She would just kind of hang out, posteriorly tilted in the pelvis. Her hip flexors, in particular her psoas, was long enough that if she lay on a table and dropped her leg off, it was almost at 45 degrees, her femur, which those are guys typically you're kind of level or a little bit down. She was so loose in all those other parts of her body. And it was basically her hamstring that was holding it all together, literally. Because her hamstring flexibility, she could basically touch just below her knees. She couldn't even touch farther down her shin. So with her, it was interesting because we basically worked on strength. We worked on strength in the whole rest of her body, and then would stretch her hamstrings and strengthen. And once she got strength in her hip flexors, in her core, in her upper body, supporting her shoulders and her legs, her hamstrings could finally loosen up. But they're the only things holding her up, basically, until we got the rest of the body strong enough to really improve that. And, along the way, her drive improved by 25 to 50 yards, within 3 weeks.
Sure.
Because she actually got strong enough to transfer that force through the system rather than being I think of a wet noodle. The force doesn't go through a wet noodle. The force goes better through, a stick than it will through a wet noodle. And she was kind of a wet noodle.
It's interesting you say that. Just in my brain, I was thinking, when we talk about fitness in general, I think for years, we've been focusing, or the industry has always focused on the highest level person. Because so instead of the lowest level person, like someone like that, where all of these classes and people talking about mobility, which is good. We may need that. But they're looking at working with the higher level athlete rather than the general person out there. So they've developed all these techniques that maybe an athlete does need. But I think a lot of times we see what the athletes do and immediately want to take that into general society. I mean, the one that comes to mind so much is, what was it, about 8 years ago? Michael Phelps showed up at the Olympics with all these dots on his body. He looked like polka dots.
All right.
From cupping.
Yeah, from the cupping. And
immediately, within weeks, I started seeing clients come in with those cupping things, marks.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, and I'd say, okay, I know you're getting massage, but why? Oh, they wanted to do it. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I said, are you just saying that? Or are you really feeling it? And I think we see that. We see what the higher level athlete does, and we want to translate that into general fitness without realizing that, guess what? I'm not Michael Phelps. I don't know if you know this, but I'm not. I don't swim quite that fast. So That's the same with our clients. So if you think about the golfer who wants to have a longer drive, well, they watch these golf videos on how to get better and, how to hit the ball farther and all this kind of stuff. Well, you're talking about people who are working with golf pros. And for that, those work great. Those exercises may work great, but if your body doesn't move anywhere near as good as that golfer does, those exercises may do you more harm than good. And we need to take a look at their bodies and figure out what they need.
I spent a bit of time at a very high-level sports performance facility, and it was really interesting because they work with a lot of the off-season athletes of all the major leagues, and I'm just watching them work, and it was really what came clear to me was this: that for many high-level athletes, first of all, you have the ability anyway. Your body can, number one, tolerate the training.
Yep.
Your body has the coordination, the mobility, the strength, the skill to do whatever it needs to do, whether it's pitching or kicking or running or whatever it is. And a lot of times, especially with young athletes, because these guys are in their 20s, they're a lot of times they're in their 20s, maybe their 30s, a lot of times they're in their 20s. And their body is still figuring out what it's doing. And so you've got this population that can already do 90% of what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. And you're just tweaking the little edges, right? I worked with a few of those, but I also worked with a whole lot of Alice and George and Fred and Louise, who are weekend warriors. Maybe they used to play soccer as a kid, and so they play soccer, once a month down at the recreation center. But the rest of the time they're sitting at a desk and they're doing computer work because that's what brings them the income for their life. And so they've got really the memory and the physical memory in some ways of their childhood, of where they used to be strong and weak. But they've also got this whole layer on top of it. And it's really looking at, okay, what are the clients that you have and what do they need? It's often very, very different than my high-level performers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you said it right there. The high-level performers are high-level performers for a reason.
Right.
Genetically, they probably recover faster, with or without performance enhancers. Their body may have more collagen to allow them to do that and to allow them to have better, whatever it is, explosive speed or, whatever. They're able to recover faster in general. I remember you hear about, I'm just going to bring up an ACL, for instance. An ACL tear, 6 to 9 months, that's what it's going to be. You're going to be out no matter what. That's the best case scenario is 6 months. Yet you hear about these athletes occasionally who are back 3 months later, and they're playing at high levels 4 months later. And that's not possible. How are they able to do that? Their bodies recover faster than the average person. And they're able to do that. Much like some people can do math in their head, like unbelievable, quantum equations and things that I just think, I can barely look at that, much less try and solve any of that. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. Well, theirs is physical. So they can tolerate, like you said, a greater amount of stress and recover from it much easier. And they're able to bounce back. And we have to keep that into consideration when we're talking about high level versus the average person. Like you said, we're going to be training generally with the average person.
You've also got, when you think about that too, especially when you think about an injured athlete, think about the resources that they have to get better. Right? They're not coming in once a week to see you with all their other responsibilities and not doing their homework, right? It's very different when your job and your financial income is dependent on your performance. It's like you're going to do everything you're supposed to do, come in, do 2 hours of this and do an ice bath and do whatever thing you need to do to recover because you need to get back on that field because you need to make a living.
Exactly.
My clients, I don't know about you, but you try to get them to do a home program. If I can give them, and I really do stick it to this, I say, okay, I'm going to give you 3 things. And I tell them when to do it. You're going to do this when you're brushing your teeth. You're going to do this when you're waiting for your coffee to boil. You're going to do this when you're waiting in line at the bank. Like whatever their daily things are, I give them those things to do, and I put them into their day.
Yep.
Otherwise, I come back and say, oh, I didn't really practice.
Yep. 100%. Life gets in the way.
Life gets in the way.
But we do tell people consistency is going to make the body change. And seeing me once a week.
The only thing that makes the body change.
Yeah.
Right. Consistency is the only thing that makes the body change.
And seeing me once a week is not going to let your body change. Even seeing me 3 times a week, you're going to see it faster. You're going to see changes. But if you do the home routine every day, and again, you're 100% right. 3 exercises, 3 things. I start with 3, maybe 5 if the person is highly, highly motivated. And, you tell them every day and you're lucky to get 3 or 4 days a week, but at least that's better than nothing. Most people don't do it at all. But like you said, the high-level athletes, they have a bigger financial burden on them. The team wants them back on the field and will spend any amount of money it takes to get them back there. And their job is to get back. So they will spend 8 hours a day if they have to doing it.
Yeah.
Imagine telling our clients, okay, you can get back into doing, golf or whatever, but it's going to require 8 hours a day of work. There's no way.
There's no way. There's no way. Exactly. I mean, I think about a lot of my ACL clients where we talked about anterior cruciate ligament, knee ligament damage. And those who recovered quickly and well, they were working hard. They did at least 2 hours a day of something.
Yep.
Exercises or PT or other kinds of things that they needed to do. Those who really didn't have successful recovery were the ones who really didn't do any homework, who, kind of said, well, the doctor will fix me or the PT will fix me. I just show up when they tell me to go and they'll take care of it. And this gets to that fundamental issue of if you want to make change, you have to be responsible and accountable to that change. Because really, as much as we love to do as trainers, we love to think we're really important and we're making all the difference in the world. If that client doesn't do the work, it doesn't happen because the body only changes through work. You got to make it do something to make the change occur.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're talking about, training someone to either be stable or mobile and looking at that continuum. A lot of things that I look at would be looking at pain patterns because that's going to tell me oftentimes if they lack stability or mobility in a certain area. You can obviously see where they lack mobility. If they're lying on their back and you ask them to drop one knee out to the side, well, either they can do it or they can't. If they take it, one side goes out 2 degrees and the other goes out 40 degrees, you could say, okay, something's going on with that one hip. And could it be a bony block? Sure. Do they have arthritis? Sure. There can be things like that. Or it could just be, the technical term here is gunked up. Could it just be all gunky? Yeah, it could be that too. And those muscles don't remember how to work that well. So we want to take a look at watching their body in motion and seeing where they may have pain. I'll give a best example is the low back. When they have low back pain, a lot of times what I see, and tell me if you see this in your practice, but they lack hip mobility, as much as they lack spinal stability. Their spine is trying to do too much and their hip isn't doing enough, whether it lacks hip extension or rotation or whatever. Their spine is trying to extend with every step they take. They're trying to rotate from their spine whenever they're trying to turn their body. And the hip should be doing more of the work.
Yeah, exactly. And so that gets back a little bit indirectly to the kinetic chain, what you're looking at in terms of how the body parts are working together. Yep. Yeah, because if the pelvis isn't moving right, and you can think about this, guys, if you picture, I spend a lot of time walking and looking at people. It's just one of those things that I do. And if you've got a lot of older clients in particular, not picking on them, but with older clients, you'll sometimes see that they sort of tip forward just a bit, like they're living in a little bit of hip flexion. And their legs, they have a tiny step. Yep. Right? They have a small little step. And oftentimes when you look at that, you realize they have no hip extension. They may not even be able to get to neutral in their hip extension. With some of those clients, if I actually try to have them stand up straight, they can't quite do it because they really literally don't even have neutral hip extension. Yep. They're actually in side flexion all the time. And that's going to influence how the whole back works, how the core works, everything. So, looking at that and going, okay, so I've got to get a little mobility in those hips because that will help the whole chain up from there and down from there.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's where, as trainers and Pilates instructors and just movement professionals, we need to look at when we're working with someone, because if they do start complaining about, let's say, knee pain, for instance, and the knee is bothering them, well, if they go to the physician, they're going to do, and I can tell you this right now, one of my clients just went this past week First thing they did, let's do an x-ray. Then let's give you some cortisone, because we see there's a lot of cartilage there, but maybe there's something else. Let's give you some cortisone and see if that clears it up. Okay, that's not going to do it. We're going to send you to PT, and the PT is going to work the knee. So they're going to do, straight leg raise and terminal knee extension and all these things for the knee. A really good physical therapist may look at it like we do, and I'm not saying there aren't that many out there, but most are focused on what the prescription says and not what we see. I'm going to look at the hip and the ankle. Because like you said, if they aren't strong enough in the hip to support their body, they may be internally rotating the femur. They could be, dipping in. That knee could be tracking issues. We may see the IT band may be tight. And if it's the foot or the ankle rolling in or rolling out, suddenly that knee's not working properly. We really need to take a look at the above and below joints of whatever is starting to become bothersome.
And that gets us to that same idea too of, okay, so oftentimes, and I do think this is true, oftentimes the first thing I do look for in a situation like that is there a limitation in mobility that is keeping this optimum movement pattern from happening? Because oftentimes, that's why they always say start with mobility, then go to stability. Now, you don't have to do that with every client. With a lot of clients, if you really see that it is a lack of, let's say, hip extension, or let's say hip extension, just to use that as an example. If they don't have that, then the mechanics will never be correct in that area, or even closer to better in that area. So that is where, if there really is a mobility limitation, I do start with trying to get some more mobility and get that joint working as it should, because then the muscles will start to follow and improve, right? And then on the other hand, again, that's a very typical thing. Is it in your case, is it an ankle mobility issue? Is it a foot mobility issue? Maybe they have a bunion, like a really big bunion on their big toe, and it's painful. So they roll out and around that big toe with every step, and that puts stress all the way up the chain.
Yep.
So looking at what are the pieces that you need to start looking at, whether it's mobility or stability, and where do you start?
Yep, absolutely. And we see that with a lot of our clients, where the compensation patterns that have occurred over the years. How many times have we seen low back pain people after they've had a knee surgery? They have a knee replacement, and suddenly out of nowhere, their back is killing them. And then you watch them walk upstairs. Well, in order to avoid bending that knee for years, they hike their hip to get up the stairs. And now that they can use their knee, they're in that pattern of just moving that way anyway. So now when they go up the stairs, they're always still hiking that hip. So they're tightening their back with every single step and not utilizing their knees the way they should. So now they have back issues. So again, looking at how their body moves in space, and are there those compensatory issues that we need to address as well? To almost re-educate and teach them, can they? Because how many times have you done it? You do step-ups, in the facility, and they're doing it perfectly. And then they go and walk stairs and they can't do it. You're like, same exercise.
What?
Same thing, but it goes back to those on the brain. The brain is reminded, oh, here's how I need to walk stairs now. And so they hike their hip instead of utilizing that knee. So they're using the wrong muscles. They're training their body for 10 years to do it wrong in order to avoid the pain. And that's something that I think we need to take a look at as well, because that area may be now hypermobile in the pelvis. They may be hiking their hips so much that they have no stability in their back, and they need to work on that now.
You're bringing up, Brian, this idea, which I think is a really good idea, and something we think about a lot, which is where what is happening with that client? What is the pattern that they have developed? Right. And the whole idea of how long it can take a pattern to unwind in the body. Right. Because, you can work on mobility and stability and kind of try to find the place on there. But change takes significant amount of time. And it's not just physical change. Our brains, as I always say, our brains are memories. We have memory. And we lay down motor patterns, and we lay down pain avoidance patterns, and we lay down just physical coordination patterns from the time, we're born and we go on through life. And those can really influence us way beyond their need, right? Way after I no longer need to hike my hip, I'm going to still hike my hip because it's just ingrained.
Yep.
And it really is, this gets us back to that idea of awareness and the importance of just paying attention and helping clients to pay attention, because it's really through that they can finally make the change, because you've really got to change that habit, not just in the body, but in the nervous system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that re-education process takes time. And again, don't want to pick on older people, but there's a reason there's the term hard to teach an old dog new tricks. It's tough to re-educate when you've done it for 30 years or more. It can be very challenging to begin to re-educate the body to do it properly. Yet something you learn when you're young, like riding a bike or whatever, you pick it up again pretty easily because you have those motions, those, muscle memory is ingrained on your brain. You know what you're doing. Your body just knows, oh, I do it like this. You may be a little wobbly at first, but then you pick it up real quick. I've seen that with athletes. Same thing. But to reverse those patterns can take a long time.
Yeah. I always think in terms of months. I know when I worked on, for example, just a tight hamstring.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with somebody who their hamstring just needs to be less tight than it is. I always say, with that, if they stretch once a week, nothing will ever change.
Right.
With mobility work, particularly, I think it has to be an everyday situation for a while. There has to be consistency for a while. And once they achieve a certain length, once they've overcome the stretch reflex and kind of change that pattern from both a physiological and a neurological level, then they can actually make progress. Mm-hmm. But it really, it just takes time and it takes consistency. So we're talking about the mobility stability continuum. Mobility work really takes consistency to make a change, to actually change the tissues and the neurological control of those tissues.
And a lot of times that needs to be done, I hate to use the word forever, but regularly.
Yeah.
Forever, especially when you talk about tight hamstrings. I have a client who always jokes that he's 5'8", but he was installed with 5'4" hamstrings. They've been tight. He's never been able to touch his knees. He goes to bend over and he's just, And stretching him now, when I first stretched him, we got to about 45 degrees, maybe. Very, very little at the hip. I've gotten him to about 80 degrees over time. But it's taken years and years and years. But if I didn't do it regularly, and if he didn't do it at home regularly, he would, I think, naturally begin to tighten up. He'd retain some of it, without a doubt. But if you don't do it regularly and you don't make it consistent effort to continue to do them, they're going to tighten back up again. I think it's just a natural tendency for certain muscles to do that. And those patterns, again, the mobility patterns that we see are going to sort of tighten back up again if it's not done on a regular basis for a prolonged period of time.
Move it or lose it.
Yeah. And I tell this
right.
I tell this all the time to my clients, because how many times have you heard, when can I stop doing the exercises? And I say, as soon as you want the pain to come back.
Right.
And exactly. You'd be surprised at how many people go, okay, then. I say, it kind of comes down to that. If you don't want the pain to come back, if you talk to someone who's in intense pain, and on a regular basis, and you say, if I taught you 3 exercises that you had to do every day for the rest of your life, but you'd be 95% out of pain, if not 100% out of pain, would you do it? Every one of them says, yes, absolutely. But then a year after you've taught the exercises and they are out of pain, you ask, how often are you doing them? The last time I did those. Well, I guess when you did them with me. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. And it's sort of like, okay, we need to make sure that that's something that gets ingrained in them, that consistency is the key for training in general, no matter what you're training. But we need to make sure that they continue on this. And if it's mobility that they need to focus on that. If it's stability they need to focus on that. And I find something interesting. You and I are slightly different when it comes to whether we want to look at stability first or mobility first. And we've talked about this before. My mindset is always, because I see a lot of low back people. So for me, almost every low back person that I've ever seen needs stability first. Because if they can't keep their body still and can't strengthen those spinal stabilizers, they can't do anything. Whereas I know you come from the standpoint of let's work on mobility and focus on that at first and then move more toward the stability later.
Well, I would beg to differ a bit because when
Okay.
it's low back, I always start with stability work.
Okay.
I always start with stability work. Again, stability work both as a training tool for stability and secondarily, but possibly primarily as an awareness tool.
Absolutely.
Of where is my back? Where is my pelvis? What is it doing? What position is most comfortable? So again, both training stability, which is important, and training the ability to hold stability, but also training the awareness of what position should my back be in? Where do I need to go? So certainly with a low back, I work on that. If I'm looking at the hips, if there's a hip problem, I'm going to look at mobility.
Yes.
I'll look at stability as well, and I'll do some stability work for sure, but I'm also going to just check and see, like, are their hip flexors really tight? Are their hamstrings really tight? Is their piriformis really tight? Like what's causing that? When I look at the knee, I'm going to really focus on, mobility comes into it sometimes, but really I focus a lot on three-dimensional knee strength.
Yep.
What's happening with the medial and the lateral quadricep? Are they tracking the patella correctly? Do they have support on the inside of the knee from the adductors and from the outside of the knee? What are their hamstrings doing? Are the medial and lateral hamstring balanced? Or are they creating like an even pull on the knee? So I think it really depends on the area, but low back, I'm with you. Stability is where I always start.
And it's interesting that when you just described those, it went back to that kinetic change sort of thing. Because truthfully, if I see someone with low back pain, I'm going to focus on stability first because I know that's what they need. But at the same time, I'm going to look at mobility of the hip and mobility of the thoracic spine because both are necessary. Because chances are their low back is asking, I don't understand why the body does this, but the low back hurts. What happens? It tries to do everybody else's job all of a sudden. It just automatically says, I'll do it all. And I don't get that. You'd think it'd say, I'm hurt. I'm going to sit on the shelf for a while and relax. No, it does double duty.
It does double duty for sure.
So I want to make sure that, okay, can I get rotation through my thoracic? Is my thoracic moving, especially into extension as well as rotation? My hips, can I go into hip extension? Because that shows, psoas, that shows iliacus, that whole hip flexor. Can it rotate properly? Or is the lumbar spine trying to do the rotation and we're seeing delamination of the discs? So looking at that, so when I see a pain pattern be, let's say, the low back, and I want to work on, okay, I need to get that stable, but I need to work on mobility upper and lower, above and below the joint. And like you said, if it is a hip problem, a lot of times you're right. That hip gets gunked up and it doesn't want to move. You need to work on mobility, 100%.
And this gets us back a little bit to where we started, or where I think we started, which is looking at stability at the deepest level, right? If I've got stability in those deep muscles around the joint, you think about the rotator cuff of the shoulder.
Yep.
If the rotator cuff on my shoulder is working, if my deep spinal muscles, my multifidi and my TA, and those are working well. In the hip, I almost think of the deep rotators as the rotator cuff of the hip.
Yep.
If my deep hip stabilizers are working, then I can build on top of that. So that's the other thing is a lot of times, I need the mobility to be able to get the stability, to get strong enough to be able to get that deep strength in there so that then I can mobilize, the more superficial muscles.
No,
so
absolutely.
Working on getting all the pieces to go together.
Absolutely. And thinking about we've been talking about the hip, getting those, deeper muscles. When I was in college, they just called them the 6 deep rotators of the hip. Didn't even name it for us. But when we're talking about those muscles, they are the rotator cuff in general, because they really do, their primary job is to hold the hip in the socket and stabilize it before even we want to go in for motion. Just like the rotator cuff's job is to make sure it's held into the socket and that it rotates properly within the joint so that we have dynamic, mobility of the joint, through all its range of motion without anything binding up, without it causing any issues. So the hip is the exact same thing. We want to make sure all of those deeper muscles are firing. And so it does require some stability at that deeper level. So I think that's a good way to look at it is that those joints, you need both.
You need both. And, again, you guys are going to get really frustrated, I suspect, out there because Brian and I always go, well, here's an option, here's another option, here's another option,
Yep.
here's another option, depending on the client. Again, both of us have been in this industry long enough to see every possible option and to kind of see, okay, well, this works pretty well here, but this is the exception. This works pretty well here, but this is the exception.
Yep.
Right? So whenever I'm looking at a client, it's like, I have an idea in my head of where I'm going to start, whatever that is, starting with mobility, starting with stability, starting with lumbo-pelvic awareness, whatever it is I'm going to start with. And we start there because that's my opportunity to get to know them and for them to get to know me and for us to get to know their body together. Right? And then you just kind of slowly work your way out to, okay, well, that didn't work. So what about this? Okay, that worked. Let's go in this direction. Yep. I think of it as this long decision tree. You kind of start somewhere because you got to start somewhere with any client. And you kind of start to assess and work your way through the different levels of things till you get a clearer view of what's happening and hopefully can address that through movement.
Absolutely. And that's a great way to look at it, that decision tree, because like you said, if someone has listened to this so far, they'd probably come out thinking, so what do I need to do? That's the first question is like, so what's more important, stability or mobility? And in this industry, 2 words, I've answered almost every question with the same 2 words. It depends.
Yeah, I use the same 2 words.
Yeah, because every single client is different. And you really have to look at the specific client in front of you and look at, again, let's talk about the low back. Lumbopelvic stability, that's what they need probably first. Even before they get to the control state, they need to be able to stabilize and hold it still at least a little bit before we begin to move it through space. Then we're going to look at the hip a little bit and see, okay, can you do a little bit of rotation while keeping lumbopelvic stability? Can you do hip flexion? Can you do rotation? Can you extend it? Can you move it and maintain that lumbopelvic stability? And if they can't, okay, what's missing? Is it that something's too tight? Or is it now that you don't have stability of the lumbar or of the hip? So now we need to take a look at those muscles of the hip and see, are they working properly? So there's a lot of things when you're looking at that decision tree and sort of looking down at thinking, okay, if yes to A, we're going to go to here. Now that goes in 3 different directions. Crap. Okay, now it's got 3. And each of those goes in 7 different directions. Oh my gosh. Okay. But that's reality. And those are the clients.
Yeah. And guys, remember, Brian and I work with clients with issues. I mean, that's,
Yep.
Both of us I've done small amounts of just sort of vanity training for aesthetics, but I primarily have trained for function and for getting people out of pain and for improving their movement patterns so that they're comfortable, functional, can do what they need to do in life. And when you go down that path, you have to customize. You have to look at that individual client and make a decision based on what you see in front of you. Doing a generic anything will get you somewhere, right? That'll get you somewhere. But to Brian's point earlier, when you talked about like the muscle, the bodybuilder, when you spend a lot of time on the superficial muscles or making the body do things that it doesn't have the foundation for,
absolutely,
which, when people are kind of overtrained or they take on training that is really beyond their physical ability, their body does whatever it needs to do to get the job done. And that's not always the most efficient, effective, or safest way for that body to move, but it will do what it needs to do to get the job done. And our job is to really pull that back, create the foundation for movement so that they can then go forward into whatever they want to do with safety and comfort and fun, right?
Absolutely. When you were just describing that, the first thing I thought of was CrossFit.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people join, and before building that foundation, and I tell every single client during their assessment, we need to build a foundation to build upon. If we don't, it's like building a house on sand. Nothing's going to work right. Nothing's going to be strong. So you build that foundation first. Well, people who join like CrossFit or one of these other high intensity places because all they're thinking about is burning calories. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to lose weight and burn calories. That's fine. But they're going to be asking their body to do something beyond what it can do and beyond what its foundational strength level is or stability level or mobility level. And you're right. the end product in their brain is just get it done, just do the repetitions, or just do the amount of time. And they're going to do it. It's going to look ugly. And they're going to develop either musculoskeletal injuries or compensatory patterns. I see this with younger people because they may not get injured, but they may develop patterns that are nearly impossible to erase 20 years down the road. If you're doing a bench press and you're doing it completely wrong for 20 years, suddenly I have to take you from a 315-pound bench press down to just the bar and teach you how to do it properly. Well, that's going to tick this person off, and they're not going to want to come back. But they're having shoulder issues and this issue and that issue. It's like, well, you've been doing something wrong for so long that you've caused all these musculoskeletal issues because of that. It's kind of like learning how to run wrong or learning how, all these type of things. You're not going to get better. You're only going to teach and ingrain poor habits and patterns.
Right. And this is where good training early on is so important. And honestly, I think that both personal training and all of the disciplines have come a long way, I think, in terms of creating much better foundational training, more land work for my swimmers. And I think in general, there's been real improvement in all of that, which I'm extremely thankful for. But, it's something we still deal with every day with every client. Like, what is your habit? What have you been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years? And what is not working about that for you, if something isn't working about that for you? And what can we do to really change that and improve that and make that better for you? Again, strength, mobility, stability, coordination, balance. What do we need to work on?
Let's look at assessments for a second. If you're having a client come to you for the first session, today's their first session, and you do their medical history and all of that kind of stuff, but now you're actually going to look at them move through space. Okay. What type of things are you going to look at for the client that will tell you whether they need, certain things moving better, that will tell you, okay, this needs to be more stable or this needs to be more mobile?
I mean, when you watch somebody walk, okay, I've just watched somebody walk in, put their purse down or their bag down, take their shoes off, walk over to the desk. I mean, first thing is I can tell right away if they're very stiff. I'm thinking about one client I have at the moment whose back's been bothering him. And man, his entire torso and hips do not move. Like he's sort of moving a little bit from his femurs and the rest of him is pretty much a brick. So when somebody comes in with something that obvious, it's like, okay, well, they're either in pain, right? And in this case, it's pain,
Guarded.
Or they're really stiff. Not a lot of mobility there. I look and see if there's an evenness, just a simple, just basic symmetry. I'm not talking about, analyzing gait particularly, but, like some people have kind of an uneven gait. It's like I call it a hitch in a get along, right? It's like it goes good, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, instead of bum, 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 or bum, 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 bum. And you'll just see that, or one hip drops. And so if I see a lot of imbalances that way, I'll think about stability for sure, especially in the low back and even in the hips. And then if I really see the stiffness, if it's a low back, I'm still going to work on stability, but I'm also going to look at what is at the root of that, or what is compensating for that stiffness and that tightness. And I may need to do some mobility work. I may need to have them go see a manual therapist to release some tight tension patterns. Again, there's an answer with a decision tree. It goes on, but
that's a great way to think about it, though, is first of all, just watch them move. Their body, like I say, we're body detectives. So we immediately, when a client walks in and I have them walk in front of me, being the gentleman I am, we're going to go to the middle of the floor and I let them walk first. I'm watching them. I'm watching them from behind. I want to see, are they moving through their ankle, their knee, their hip? Are they rotating through their thoracic? And it's only 7 or 8 steps, but that's going to give me an indication, oh, wow, they are moving so stiff, they're not moving. Or they're loose in their hips. They have this this hip gait maybe to one side where their hip is slinging out a lot on one side, but not on the other. Okay.
Yeah.
Did they have a hip replacement? No. Okay. What else could be going on? Again, I'm not diagnosing. I'm just noticing, because that's going to tell me or add to my picture of this person when they leave and tells me, okay, here's what I may need to start working them on. So having them stand on one leg, do they sink their hip out? Do they lean? Do they do, all of these kind of things will tell me, okay, they lack strength and stability in the hip. Okay, I need to work on that. Are they walking like an old person? Or like a Parkinsomal person who, before they ever take a step, they lean their body forward and then their leg steps forward to catch them before they start moving. Okay, they lack glute strength. They're not propelling themselves through space. They're catching themselves from falling down. Okay, these are things that we can see when we're just watching the body. And we can say, okay, I need to work on their glute strength, or I need to work on some hip extension in some way, shape, or form, because they are permanently pitched forward. They are leaning forward the whole time. There's the Thomas test that you and I do on a lot of people. You lay them off on their back with their legs sort of over the edge of a table. You pull both legs in and let one leg drop and see, do they have good hip extension? Or when they drop their leg off, is that leg way up in the air? If it is, that can tell you, okay, wow, their quad, their hip flexor may be incredibly tight. And these are type of assessments that, we teach in our classes and whatnot that will tell people, okay, here's where we need to focus on. So in every single assessment that I do, I make sure I'm looking for these things, because that's going to tell me, okay, I need to focus on their hip flexibility and mobility, or I need to work on getting them to turn through their spine more, because my gosh, their thoracic is not rotating when they're stepping. They're walking and they are just a brick from their pubic bone all the way up to their, neck. They don't move at all. So these are all things that I look at, same as you, that are sort of assessments, but I'm just watching their body move through space.
And that happens from the moment they walk in. It always does. It's like, how do they sit down? How do they sit down and take their shoes off? And in Pilates world, they often work without shoes. And where do they are they comfortable in sitting down? Mm-hmm. Do they use a hand to help them to come down? Do they move quickly with confidence, or do they move kind of gingerly? And then just again walk across the room. I do the same thing. I stand back where I am and just say, hey, well, I'll meet you over at the reformer. I'll meet you over on the other side of the room, and just watch them walk, because that'll tell you a lot. And it's also looking at them when they're not thinking about it.
Right.
Because I also want to see, what is their unconscious pattern? Not what are they doing when they're trying to be all perfect for me, and I'm like saying, let's do a standing assessment. You're going to stand there. I'm going to judge you, right? That's guaranteed to not give you, for most people, quite as honest an assessment as if you kind of sneak it in when they don't know that you're watching, right?
Yep. You said a great one that I love, and it tells me more about their hips than anything else. Have them put on their shoes.
Yeah.
If they can cross their leg to put on their shoes, I see, and you probably see the same, especially with men. One leg, they cross, they tie their shoes. The other foot, they lean over to the floor because they can't cross the leg.
Exactly.
And right there, that's going to tell me, oh, that side's a little gunked up. That side needs a little bit more work. But again, it's telling me, okay, I can see that pattern. I can see, okay, that left hip, man, he does not want to cross that leg. Nothing wrong with that, just for us, okay.
Good to know.
Good to know. Write it down, because that may tell us, oh, that could be part of the back issue. That's a good possibility, because he's lacking mobility on that side. Could that one side of his pelvis be really locked up? Oh, he's been having SI joint problems. Oh, no kidding. All righty then. So
the body detectives in action.
Exactly. And just allowing those body parts to move in space naturally. One thing that I have everybody do, take your hands over your head and touch the backs of your hands together over your head. That shows me glenohumeral rhythm, scapulohumeral rhythm. Is it moving normally? Is one side really hiked up? Is one shoulder in their ear? Can they even get there? Or is it in front of their body, instead of being directly overhead? All of these things tell me that. Can they put their hands behind their head and take their elbows out wide? Just allowing their body to move in space. And I do it quickly. I do it so fast that they don't even know what I'm doing. I say, just take your hands over your head, touch your backs of your hands. Cool. Take your hands behind your head. And if they move so gingerly that they can barely get there, it's like, okay. Anterior shoulder girdle, super tight. Got it. So that's going to tell me something we need to focus on for the mobility aspect. Or if they do it with no problem, but they're still having rotator cuff issues, for instance, and they can do certain ranges of motion with no problem, but there's these compensatory issues, like their scapula is way rotated out and upperly rotated in order for them to do that. It's like, okay, you don't have scapulohumeral stability or scapulothoracic stability, excuse me. So, okay, that's where I need to start with that person. So there's ways that we can look at just how the body moves in space that's going to decide for us what they need more and what joints need it. And again, I like to start core first and work my way out. I usually start, core, hips, then a little bit of thoracic, then get a little lower on the body, then go a little upper. It's just my methodology. I know other people start at the foot and work their way up. Totally fine. As long as you've got a method to your madness, I'm good with it. If you're seeing success, I'm good with it. But I want to make sure that, you have a method to the madness and that you're looking at everything, assessing them every time they come in to see you to a certain degree. Are they getting better? Can they now cross their leg? Can they, rotate? Can they lean forward? Are they bending better? Are they able to flatten their back or do a pelvic tilt now that they weren't before? These are all ways that we can do these moderate, minor assessments on a regular basis.
I call them assessorcises.
I love that word. Yes.
I think you've heard me say that. I've decided to coin that phrase.
Yep.
Because when you're watching somebody move or do the basic fundamental exercises, yes, they're doing the exercise, but the whole time I'm looking at how are they doing the exercises? What is the quality of their movement? Do they have the range of motion that I want them to have? Are they stable in their hips? Are they not stable in their hips? Is all their weight on their left side, right? Those are all ways to look at that. And it allows the client to keep working, right? Feel like they're getting something out of the session, because that's very important to a client, like I'm doing something.
Yep.
And it allows me to learn an awful lot without having to say, okay, let's assess this and take the time off for that.
And how many times is an exercise an assessment and vice versa?
Yeah, exactly.
They come into you and you'll do something with them, like standing on one foot. That's a total assessment, but that can also be the hardest exercise you give them to do at home, depending on the person.
Exactly.
So really looking at every single exercise as an assessment, or a lot of them, because that's going to tell you so much about that client. And are you ready to progress, or do you need to regress?
Yep.
Because, not everybody's ready to go forward. And also there's progression through regression, having them do something that's a little bit easier and suddenly they can do it better, and vice versa, having them do something so hard, but now they're able, a great example that I use of this is having someone stand on one foot. They can't do it, and they need all this balance help. So I'll have them stand on a BOSU or a balance pad. So much harder. But the body has to try and figure it out. And yes, they're holding on, and I'm got them in a safe position, and they're doing it for 30 seconds. And then I have them stand without it, and suddenly like, hey, this feels easy now. Okay. We take a big step forward under safe conditions and then back that off. And looking at the body and seeing what it's capable of doing is that assessment technique that we can say, okay, here's where we need to go next. In looking at that decision tree and really trying to figure that out. So I think looking at that kinetic chain that we looked at the beginning is probably a great way for us to sort of come back around, because we started with that and saying this is stable and this is mobile. Whereas in general, what we're looking at is it stable enough and is it mobile enough?
Yeah.
So does the low back have enough stability? And at the same time, maybe it's too stable, so it might need mobility. So for that, I may look at stability first. And if they have that, maybe they can't do much flexion. Maybe it's an older gentleman who hasn't flexed his spine in years. So maybe they do need mobility. Then look at the hip. Maybe they need more mobility because it's so tight, because they don't have hip extension or whatnot. Then we begin to work on the stabilizers to assist with that, but also to get it to move better. So really taking a look at, okay, is it considered stable? Is it considered, mobile? What should we be looking at? How do we want to work with this client? How do we want to train that?
And always looking up and down.
Yes.
Right. Always looking at the whole chain, right? Not getting focused on one part of the chain, but going, okay, well, that's not moving. Okay, if that's not moving, if the hip isn't moving, what's happening with the spine, what's happening with the knee, what's happening with the foot, what's happening with the thorax? And then, pulling that whole story together, trying to get the whole story for that client.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's really what you should be thinking about when you're working with your clients. You really want to be thinking
Yeah.
about connecting the kinetic chain. I tell that to a lot of students in that, look, doctors and physical therapists often are going to treat the body part that's injured. We can treat the whole kinetic chain. And I hate to use the word treat, but we can work it. We can really think about the whole kinetic chain working as one and being able
Understand,
to
analyze, improve. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So taking a look at the knee, taking a look at the hip. If it's the knee, could it be the hip or could it be the spine? Could be everything. And we really want to take a look at that, look up and down the kinetic chain. Is everything working properly? When doing those assessments, does it look proper or does it look like there is that hitch in the giddy up? And could that be part of the problem? Who knows? Like I say, we're not diagnosing anything, but it could be. So let's address that as well as the other things. So, out of curiosity, if there was some parting thought that you could give to our lovely listeners out there. See, Nora and I do this all the time. We'll get on a conversation like this and we can go for 2 to 3, 4 hours on just one topic and get so deep in the weeds that I have to remind myself, okay, I want to come back to what can we do? What's the one thing that you would want to impart on, someone who's listening to this that would help them in their practice?
I think to add the one piece I would say is what I see in a lot of beginning teachers is they do like to see the world as black and white, and they like to see the world as here's the problem, here's the solution. And when you're a new teacher, that's really important that you kind of have a problem and you have at least a solution to start with. Right?
Yep.
What I want you to really encourage you to think about is yes, there is a black and a white, there's a yes and a no, there's a mobility and there's a stability. But I want you to understand that the practice of what we do is really working through that gray area between the two. Understanding the role of mobility in the low back, the role of stability in the hips, how those come together. The body is a whole. The body is actually not its parts. We often will deal with one part at a time. And that idea of bringing it all together, of looking up and down the chain, of thinking about mobility and stability as a continuum, that's probably where I would just, those little thought seeds to put in your head as you go forward and see your clients this week or teach your classes this week.
I like that. I like that thought process because it's not about whether something should be trained one way or the other, but more on that continuum. I find that, like you said, as people get more and more educated, they have a tendency to become very narrow in what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what's stable or what's mobile. And it does become binary. It becomes very black and white. And how I have to remind some of my students and the people that I work with is when you look at correct form, sometimes good enough is good enough. Things don't have to be perfect. And it's the same thing here on that same continuum. Whereas, perfection in certain minds' eye would be this very narrow band. Widen that band a little bit. Widen it a little bit and explore. Explore both sides of things and understand that every joint needs to be stable and every joint needs to be mobile. And maybe pick your favorite exercise or two for each. Like for the hip, the clamshell. It's good for stability. It's also teaching some mobility. What would be your favorite mobility one then? You add to that. And you can begin to see and create in your mind, oh, well, you know what? Almost everybody needs to stretch their hip flexors. Almost everybody needs to maybe work on the piriformis or hip rotation. Okay, it needs both, not just one. So if that's the one thought that I kind of want to get through is that every joint needs both stability and mobility within its proper range of motion so that it's moving properly throughout its arc, but it's also being stable so that it's moving properly within its joint.
Nice. Well said.
So kind of my thought on this. Thank you so much for joining us. I enjoy this as always. Every chance I get a chance to talk with you, I learn so much, Nora, and it's always a pleasure. I do want to remind people that you can reach us at movingconvos@gmail.com. That's our email. We are on Twitter at Moving Convos. We are on Instagram at Moving Convos. So that hashtag will get you to a lot of places at Moving Convos. And yeah, any parting thoughts you'd like to leave anybody with?
Just go out there and do your best. Love what you do. Inspire your clients. Make them move. That's our job.
Yes. Keep them moving, please. Motion is lotion. We say it a lot. And I think that isn't, especially in the world of Zoom, I think that has a lot to be said for now.
Amen.
All right. Well, for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. Thank you for joining us at Moving Conversations. We will see you next time.